What would you do if a direct order could save your life? And obeying it meant letting thousands of strangers die. Tonight's story, a young pilot, Lieutenant Yuna, barely 40 hours of combat time, hovering above a city called New Jakarta. As it burns, her commander is screaming at her to come home. The sky above her is filling with something that should not be possible. And in the next few minutes, she will have to decide what kind of person she truly is. Stay with me, because what she chooses will define everything that follows.
The first thing she noticed was the vibration. It ran through the control stick and into her hands, low and uneven, like the aircraft was breathing wrong. Not failing yet, but moving in that direction. The kind of problem that didn't announce itself with a single alarm, but instead settled into the frame of the machine and stayed there, constant, waiting. She adjusted her grip slightly, feeling for changes, for patterns. The vibration deepened when she pushed the throttle, eased when she pulled back. Heat buildup. Engine strain. Manageable, for now. Lieutenant CO, you are ordered to return to base immediately. The voice cut through the cockpit, precise and controlled, layered over the softer hum of failing systems and the sharper edge of warning tones that had been active long enough to fade into the background. Yuna didn't answer. Her eyes stayed forward, fixed on the sky over New Jakarta, trying to make sense of what she was seeing without forcing it into something familiar. The sky had structure now. It wasn't empty space anymore. It had lines, angles, density. Hundreds of contacts arranged in a pattern so exact it resisted comprehension, each one holding position with a discipline that felt mechanical and intentional at the same time. For a brief second, her mind tried to resolve them as something harmless, something distant, but the motion broke that illusion. They were descending, slowly, deliberately, like gravity itself had been given direction. Lieutenant CO, acknowledge. Her fingers tightened on the stick, not enough to register as input, just enough to ground herself in something real. The aircraft responded with a slight resistance, a reminder that it was already operating beyond what it had been designed to tolerate. She exhaled through her nose, slow and controlled, and keyed the comms. I read you. Systems holding. That wasn't true, but it wasn't a lie either. The systems were holding together. That was enough. There was a pause, and in that pause she could hear the rest of the channel. Distant voices layered under each other, fragments of instructions, confirmations, requests that overlapped and cut off. The sound of a command structure stretched thin, but still functioning. Yuna, land. The shift in tone was immediate. Commander Hale had dropped the formal address, the edge of authority softening into something closer to familiarity. That made it harder to ignore. She didn't respond. Instead, she dipped the nose of the interceptor just slightly and let her gaze fall to the city below. New Jakarta was moving, but not in any way that could be called orderly. The evacuation had begun too late for that. Transports lifted in staggered intervals, some rising cleanly, others fighting for altitude under uneven loads. Their engine trails cut bright lines through layers of smoke that clung to the upper atmosphere, marking paths that were already being watched, already being calculated. She tracked one of them as it climbed, its ascent slower than it should have been. Overloaded, pushed beyond recommended capacity. It didn't matter. There wasn't time for recommended anything anymore. Above it, the alien formation adjusted. Not quickly, not in response to any single movement. The change was gradual, almost subtle, but unmistakable once you saw it. Angles tightened, distances closed. Lines that had been parallel began to converge. It was the kind of motion that didn't look aggressive until you understood what it meant. They weren't chasing the transports. They were removing the space those transports needed to survive. Evacuation is at 70%, Hale said, his voice returning to a steadier cadence. You've completed your assignment. Return to base. 70%. The number sat in her mind without attaching to anything solid. 30% remained. 30% of the city still on the ground or waiting for clearance to launch. 30% of something that could not be reduced to a statistic, no matter how many times command tried to make it one. She swallowed, and the inside of her mouth felt dry, metallic. She shifted in her seat slightly, becoming aware of the pressure points where the harness dug into her shoulders, the stiffness that had settled into her back from hours of continuous flight. Her left hand flexed once on the throttle, fingers stiff, then settled again. 40 hours of combat time. It sounded like more when it was written down. In practice, it was barely enough to form habits, to make reactions instinctive instead of deliberate. She was still thinking through most of her decisions, still aware of the gap between what she should do and what she actually did. There had been one moment where that gap had mattered. She didn't see it clearly all at once. It came in fragments. The angle of another interceptor sliding into her peripheral vision. The tone of a warning that she hadn't processed quickly enough. The space where she should have moved and didn't. Someone else had filled that space. Someone who had known exactly what would happen and had done it anyway. There hadn't been time to say anything. There never was. The channel had been full of other voices, other problems, other instructions. By the time the space cleared, the moment was already gone, replaced by the next engagement, the next decision, the next chance to make the same mistake again. Yuna, Hale said again, and now there was something else in his voice, something that didn't belong to command at all. If you stay up there, you are not coming back. She looked down again, but not at the same transport. This one was further along, breaking through the upper cloud layer, its engines burning clean and steady as it angled toward open space. For a second, it was just a shape against a brighter sky, almost peaceful if you ignored everything around it. She followed it until it passed beyond her immediate field of view. Time. That was all this was about. Not victory. Not holding territory. Not even survival in the way it was usually defined. Just time. Each second that those transports remained untouched was another second closer to escape velocity, another second less likely to be intercepted. She inhaled slowly, the recycled air in the cockpit carrying the faint smell of heated circuitry and something sharper underneath it, something she didn't want to identify. The temperature had crept up without her noticing, the environmental system lagging behind the stress on the rest of the aircraft. A thin line of sweat traced down the side of her neck, cooling quickly against the fabric of her suit. I know, she said. It was the simplest answer she could give. Not a refusal, not an acceptance, just acknowledgement. On her tactical display, the alien fighters began to shift more decisively. Their movement resolved into vectors now, trajectories that intersected with the rising paths of the transports. The calculations updated in real time, probability markers shifting as each new piece of data came in. She didn't need the numbers. The pattern was enough. They were closing. Lieutenant CO, Hale said, the command tone returning, sharper now, reinforced by everything that came with rank and authority. That is a direct order. Return to base immediately. For a moment, she let herself consider it fully. Turning back, reducing throttle, dropping altitude, and aligning with the approach corridor. There would still be a runway. There would still be a structure waiting to receive her, to debrief, to assign meaning to what had already happened. There would still be a version of this where she lived. Another transport lifted from the city, its ascent unsteady but persistent. She watched it for exactly 1 second. Then she pushed the throttle forward. The engine responded with a strained surge, the vibration sharpening into something harsher, more aggressive, no longer a warning but a consequence. Heat indicators flared brighter across her console, a cascade of alerts that demanded attention and received none. The interceptor accelerated, cutting a direct line toward the tightening alien formation. Yuna, I'll hold them, she said, her voice even, controlled, as if she were stating a routine adjustment instead of rewriting the outcome of the next several minutes. Get them out. There was a brief silence on the channel, not empty but full, carrying everything that didn't need to be said. Copy, Hale answered. No argument. No repetition. No attempt to override what had already been decided. Yuna adjusted her vector, placing herself directly between the advancing fighters and the ascending transports. The tactical display filled with threat markers, each one representing a path that would intersect with her own. The density of it pushed the system to its limits, icons overlapping, prioritization algorithms struggling to keep up. It didn't matter. She didn't need to track all of them. She just needed to be where they had to pass.
So here's where we stand. Lieutenant Yuna, our rookie pilot, barely 40 hours of combat time. Commander Hale has ordered her home. The evacuation sits at 70%, which means 30% of New Jakarta is still on the ground. And the alien formation isn't chasing transports, it's closing the sky around them. But Yuna has pushed her throttle forward. She has placed her failing interceptor directly in their path. One damaged aircraft, one untested pilot. Watch what she does next.
Her world narrowed until it contained only a few things. The pressure of the controls under her hands, the strained hum of the engine pushing beyond safe limits, the persistent vibration that had started all of this, now stronger, more insistent, like something alive inside the frame of the aircraft. And the space in front of her, the space she would not give them. She drew in a slow breath, held it for a fraction of a second, then released it, steadying herself in the only way that mattered. Then she flew directly into them. The first contact came sooner than her systems predicted, not because the calculations were wrong, but because the enemy did not need to wait for perfect alignment. One of the alien fighters broke formation by a fraction, just enough to create an opening in the geometry of their advance, and then accelerated. It did not rush. It moved with controlled intent, its vector intersecting hers at an angle that forced a decision. Yuna rolled instinctively, banking hard to starboard as the first streak of energy crossed the space where she had been less than a second before. The light was wrong. Not like any human weapon she had trained against. It did not flare or scatter. It cut, clean and contained, leaving a brief afterimage that lingered against her vision. Her interceptor shuddered as she pulled through the turn, the vibration deepening into a harsh, uneven pulse that she felt in her forearms. Contact, single interceptor engaging, she said, more to anchor herself than to inform anyone else. The channel responded with overlapping acknowledgments, but they were distant, secondary to the immediate reality in front of her. The alien fighter adjusted again, matching her movement with an accuracy that felt less like reaction and more like anticipation. It did not overshoot. It did not correct. It simply remained where it needed to be, its weapons tracking her with a precision that left no margin for error. She cut throttle for half a second. The interceptor lurched as the sudden reduction in thrust shifted its balance, the nose dipping slightly before she compensated. The alien shot passed ahead of her this time, missing not because she had outmaneuvered it in any conventional sense, but because she had broken the rhythm it expected. She felt the difference immediately. The vibration changed, not easing but altering, as if the aircraft itself was responding to the unpredictability. Again, she murmured under her breath, not realizing she had spoken aloud. She pushed forward, then pulled back sharply, forcing the interceptor into a tighter arc than it was meant to sustain. The structural warnings spiked, a sharp tone cutting through the rest, but she ignored it. The alien fighter followed, its path still precise, still controlled, but now adjusting more frequently, micro-corrections that hadn't been there before. Below them, another transport cleared the lower cloud layer. Yuna didn't look at it directly this time. She tracked it through the corner of her vision, enough to know it was still moving, still climbing. That was enough. The second alien fighter entered the engagement without announcement. It slid into her peripheral display as a new contact marker, its vector intersecting hers from below, forcing her to split her attention. The first maintained pressure, keeping her pinned in a narrowing corridor of movement, while the second angled for a clean shot. She exhaled slowly, forcing her breathing to stay even despite the rising tension in her chest. Two vectors, 2 points of pressure. The space between them was shrinking. She didn't try to escape it. Instead, she accelerated into it. The interceptor surged forward, the engine protesting with a sharper, more aggressive vibration that rattled through the frame and into her bones. She angled down slightly, then rolled, threading the narrow gap between the two approaching fighters at a speed that left no room for hesitation. For a fraction of a second, everything aligned. Their firing solutions disrupted, their positions offset just enough to create a pocket of space that hadn't existed before. She fired. The recoil was minimal, but she felt it anyway, a subtle shift through the controls as her weapons discharged. The shot connected with the first alien fighter at an angle, not enough to destroy it outright, but enough to disrupt its stability. Its path wavered for the first time, a deviation so small it would have gone unnoticed in any other context. Here it mattered. The second fighter adjusted immediately, compensating for the disruption, its trajectory shifting to re-establish control of the engagement. Yuna didn't give it the chance. She pulled hard into a vertical climb, the interceptor straining under the sudden change, warning indicators flashing brighter as the heat buildup spiked. Her vision narrowed at the edges, the strain of the maneuver pressing against her body, but she held it, pushing through the discomfort. The sky above her was still crowded, still filled with movement, but now there was space. Thin, temporary, but real. Evacuation at 78%. A voice reported over the channel. 78. The number landed somewhere in the back of her mind, anchoring itself there. Progress. Not enough, but moving. The damaged alien fighter recovered faster than she expected. Its system stabilized, its path smoothing out as it re-entered formation with the others. It did not pursue her directly. Instead, it resumed its position in the larger pattern, contributing to the slow, deliberate constriction that continued to tighten around the transports. They were not focused on her. Not yet. She was an obstacle, a variable, something to account for, but not something that altered the outcome. That would change. Another pair of fighters broke from the formation, their approach vectors staggered to limit her options. One high, one low, both converging on her current position with a timing that forced her into a reactive posture. She adjusted, rolling and diving to offset their alignment, but she could feel the pressure building, the space around her shrinking again. The vibration in the interceptor intensified, no longer a background sensation, but a constant presence, sharp and insistent. The engine temperature climbed into ranges that triggered automatic safeguards, systems attempting to compensate for conditions they had not been designed to sustain for this long. Yuna, your heat levels are spiking, Hale said, his voice cutting through the channel with renewed urgency. You need to disengage and cycle your systems. She didn't respond. Disengaging meant space. Space meant time. Time was the one thing she could not give them. She dipped lower, bringing the engagement closer to the upper edge of the cloud layer. The air here was thicker, less predictable, the interference affecting both her systems and theirs. It wasn't an advantage, not exactly, but it introduced variables. And variables were something she could work with. The two fighters followed, their movements still precise, but now adjusting more frequently, compensating for the changing conditions. Their firing patterns shifted slightly, timing altered to account for the interference. She smiled, just barely, a small, involuntary reaction that had nothing to do with humor and everything to do with recognition. They were adapting. That meant they had to. She rolled again, cutting across their approach vectors at an angle that forced them to choose between maintaining formation and securing a shot. One hesitated, just a fraction, just long enough for her to slip past its firing line. The other committed, its weapon discharging in a clean line that grazed the edge of her interceptor. The impact was immediate. A sharp jolt ran through the frame, followed by a cascade of warnings as one of her outer panels registered damage. The vibration shifted again, uneven now, layered with a new instability that she could feel through the controls. Minor hull breach detected. The system reported in a flat, neutral tone. She ignored it. Her focus stayed forward, on the next movement, the next adjustment, the next fraction of a second that would determine whether she was still here to make another one. Below her, another transport broke free of the atmosphere. Evacuation at 83%. 83. She adjusted her grip, flexing her fingers once before settling them back into place. The stiffness was worse now, the fatigue creeping in despite her efforts to ignore it. Her shoulders burned, a dull, constant ache that she pushed to the edge of her awareness. It didn't matter. Not yet. The alien fighters continued to close, their formation tightening again as they adapted to her presence. She was no longer an ignored variable. Their vectors accounted for her explicitly now, paths shifting to limit her influence, to reduce the space she could operate in. Good. That meant they were watching her. That meant they were not watching something else. She angled the interceptor back upward, drawing them with her, pulling their attention away from the transports that still climbed behind her. The sky above was still crowded, still filled with movement, but now it felt different. Not empty space waiting to be filled, but contested ground. Her ground. The vibration steadied slightly, not because the strain had lessened, but because she had adjusted to it, her body aligning with the rhythm of the failing machine. The heat remained high, the warnings constant, but they faded into the background again, secondary to the immediate demands of the engagement. Evacuation at 87%. She didn't acknowledge it. She didn't need to. The number was enough. 87. She could hold a little longer. She pushed the throttle forward again, ignoring the way the engine protested, ignoring the way the vibration sharpened into something almost violent. The interceptor surged ahead, cutting directly into the path of the next wave of alien fighters as they moved to close the final gaps in their formation. Her breath came steady now, controlled. Each inhale and exhale measured against the movement of the aircraft, the rhythm of the fight. She did not think about landing. She did not think about what came after. There was only this space, this time, and the simple, unchanging decision that had brought her here and would keep her here until there was nothing left to hold. She stayed in their path, and she did not move aside. The next wave did not break formation when it came for her. It tightened. Yuna saw it happen in the smallest adjustments, distances between fighters narrowing, angles aligning not just for interception but for containment. They were no longer treating her as a single moving target. They were treating the space around her as something to be controlled, reduced, eliminated. Her interceptor trembled under her hands as she pushed it into another turn, the strain now constant, no longer rising and falling, but sitting at a level that felt like it could tip into failure at any moment. The heat warnings had stabilized at critical, cycling between thresholds the system could no longer meaningfully manage. The air inside the cockpit felt thinner, warmer, carrying the faint scent of overheated insulation that she tried not to think about. Yuna, your port stabilizer is degrading, Hale said, his voice tight despite the effort to keep it controlled. You're losing structural integrity. I'm still flying, she replied. That was all that mattered. 3 fighters approached in a staggered pattern, one slightly ahead, 2 trailing at offset angles that boxed her in from above and below. Their timing was precise, not synchronized, but deliberately desynchronized, forcing her to respond to each threat separately while compressing the time she had to do it. She dipped the nose and accelerated, not away from them, but toward the lead fighter. The decision came without hesitation now, no longer weighed against alternatives. Closing distance disrupted their firing solutions. It always had. The first shot passed close enough that the cockpit filled briefly with a sharp, white glare. She didn't flinch. Her focus stayed locked on the shape ahead of her, on the slight adjustments it made as it recalculated her trajectory. It moved with confidence, its path smooth, efficient, predictable. At the last possible moment, she cut thrust. The interceptor dropped slightly, its forward momentum carrying it beneath the line of fire. The trailing fighters adjusted instantly, their paths bending to compensate, but the timing shifted. For a fraction of a second, they occupied the same space, their firing solutions overlapping. She fired into that overlap. The shot connected with the lead fighter at close range, the impact tearing through its outer structure and disrupting its stability completely. This time there was no recovery. Its path broke apart, motion fragmenting as control failed, the remains of it scattering across the engagement zone. The other 2 adjusted, but not cleanly. Their alignment had been broken, their positions compromised by the sudden loss of their lead. It cost them a moment. Yuna used it. She pulled up hard, the interceptor responding with a violent shudder that ran through the entire frame. The warning tones spiked again, louder now, more insistent, but she ignored them. Her vision narrowed at the edges as the strain built, pressure pressing against her chest, her arms, her legs. Evacuation at 91%, a voice reported. 91. The number hit harder than the others had. Close enough now that she could feel the end of it, not as certainty, but as possibility. The alien formation shifted again, not in response to the loss of a single fighter. That was already accounted for. This was something else. Their pattern tightened further, their vectors adjusting to isolate her more completely, to limit the space she could influence. They were adapting faster now. Good. She angled the interceptor across their new approach lines, forcing them to account for her again, to divert resources, to shift attention. Each adjustment they made for her was something not applied to the transports still climbing behind her. Another pair of fighters broke through her peripheral display, approaching from opposite sides, their timing offset just enough to prevent a single clean maneuver from avoiding both. She chose one. She always chose one. The interceptor rolled sharply, her focus narrowing to the threat on her right. The left side fighter fired as she moved, the shot grazing her hull with a sharp, jarring impact that sent a ripple through the frame. A new set of warnings flared across her console, damage indicators lighting up in clusters. Structural integrity at 60%, the system reported. She didn't acknowledge it. Her attention stayed on the fighter she had chosen, closing the distance, forcing the engagement into a space where precision mattered more than numbers. It responded in kind, its movements tightening, its path adjusting to meet her directly. For a moment, they were aligned. Then she broke the alignment. A sudden, sharp roll combined with a throttle surge shifted her trajectory just enough to slip past its firing line. She felt the heat spike again as the engine strained to keep up with the demand, the vibration turning harsher, more uneven. She fired as she passed. The shot clipped the fighter's flank, not enough to destroy it, but enough to destabilize its path. It wavered, its movement losing the clean precision it had maintained until now. That was enough. She didn't follow through. She didn't need to. Disruption was the goal, not elimination. Behind her, the damaged fighter attempted to recover, its path correcting in small, rapid adjustments that lacked the smooth certainty of before. It would stabilize. They always did. But it would take time. Time she could spend somewhere else. Evacuation at 94%. Her grip tightened again, the stiffness in her hands now constant, her fingers slower to respond than they had been at the start. She flexed them once against the controls, forcing movement, forcing responsiveness. The cockpit had grown hotter, the air thicker, each breath requiring more effort than the last. Sweat traced down her back beneath the suit, cooling in patches where the environmental system still held. Her focus remained steady. Forward. Always forward. The alien fighters pressed closer, their formation no longer broad and encompassing but dense and concentrated around her position. They had reduced the engagement space to a narrow corridor, one that forced her into constant motion just to remain within it. They were trying to pin her. She refused to be pinned. Another shot tore across her path, closer this time, the light filling her vision for a fraction of a second. She rolled through it, the interceptor responding with a delayed, uneven motion that told her exactly how close she was to losing control. "Yuna, you're losing response time," Hale said. There was no attempt to hide it now. The urgency was clear, sharp, cutting through the channel. "You need to disengage. Now." She didn't answer. Below her, another transport cleared the atmosphere. Evacuation at 96%. 96. 2% left. 2% of a city. 2% of lives still climbing, still exposed, still needing time. Her vision flickered at the edges, not from damage to the cockpit, but from the strain of holding everything together for this long. She blinked once, hard, clearing it, forcing her focus back into alignment. The alien formation shifted again. This time, it was immediate. A coordinated movement, multiple fighters adjusting at once, their vectors converging on her position with a precision that left no room for escape. They had reached a conclusion. Remove the variable. In the interference. The space around her collapsed. She saw it in the way their paths intersected, in the way the firing angles overlapped, in the way every possible direction of movement was accounted for and countered. For the first time since the engagement began, there was no obvious path forward. Her hands remained steady on the controls. Her breathing did not change. She did not look for a way out. She looked for a way through. The vibration in the interceptor peaked, a harsh, rattling force that felt like it might tear the aircraft apart from the inside. The engine temperature crossed into a range that triggered automatic shutdown protocols. She overrode them. The system hesitated, then complied. The interceptor surged forward one more time. Not away. Through. She drove directly into the convergence point, into the center of their firing solution, forcing them to adjust in real time to a movement that broke every expectation they had built. The first shots passed behind her. The second wave missed by less. The third. She rolled, twisted, pushed the interceptor beyond what it could sustain, every movement costing more than the last, every correction slower, heavier, harder to execute. But still enough. Always just enough. She broke through the center of their formation, emerging on the other side with the sky opening briefly in front of her, a thin slice of space that had not yet been claimed. Behind her, the formation fractured for a fraction of a second, their alignment disrupted, their calculations forced to reset. It wouldn't last. It didn't need to. Evacuation at 98%. 98. She exhaled slowly, the breath leaving her in a controlled release that steadied her hands just enough for what came next. 2% left. She could hold that. She would hold that, no matter what it cost. The last 2% did not move faster. If anything, it felt slower, as if time itself had stretched under the weight of what remained. Yuna tracked the final cluster of transports through the edge of her display, their ascent uneven and strained, engines burning longer than they should have, pushing against limits that had already been exceeded. One of them lagged behind the others, its climb shallow, its trajectory unsteady. That was the one the alien formation began to favor. Not all at once, not dramatically, just a gradual shift in priority, a subtle reallocation of vectors that drew a portion of their fighters toward the weakest point in the evacuation. It was efficient, logical, the cleanest way to collapse the remaining escape window. Yuna saw it before the system flagged it. Her eyes moved before the indicators updated, her hands adjusting the interceptor's heading without conscious thought. The aircraft resisted, the response slower now, heavier, as if every command had to push through resistance before it became motion. Yuna, you're drifting, Hale said, his voice tighter than before. Stay with the main. I see it. She cut in, not sharply, just enough to stop him from finishing. The interceptor dipped, then surged as she forced more power through the already strained engine. The vibration climbed again, sharper now, layered with a faint, irregular stutter that told her exactly how close she was to losing propulsion entirely. She ignored it. There was no adjustment left that would make the aircraft safer. There was only forward. She angled toward the trailing transport. The alien fighters adjusted immediately, their vectors bending to intercept her path before she could fully align with it. They did not rush. They did not need to. Their timing remained precise, calculated to meet her at the exact point where she would become effective. She reached that point anyway. The first exchange came fast and close. She rolled through a narrow firing line, felt the heat of a near pass wash across the cockpit, and answered with a short burst that forced one of the interceptors to break its line. It wasn't damage that mattered, it was displacement. Every deviation pulled their formation further from perfect alignment. Behind her, the trailing transport climbed another fraction higher. Evacuation at 99%. A voice said over the channel, quieter now, as if the number itself carried weight. 99. The final transport. Yuna's breath came slower now, more deliberate. Each inhale felt heavier than the last, the air inside the cockpit thick and warm, carrying the sharp edge of overheated systems. Sweat traced down her temple, slipping past her collar, cooling briefly before the heat took it again. Her hands remained steady, not because she wasn't tired, but because there was no room left for anything else. The alien fighters closed in again, tighter than before, their formation no longer broad or adaptive but focused, concentrated entirely on her position and the space around the last transport. They had reached the same conclusion she had. End this, and the outcome was decided. She adjusted her vector slightly, placing herself directly between them and the transport, not chasing, not intercepting, just occupying the line they would have to cross. It was a smaller space now, narrower, harder to hold. That made it simpler. The first shot came from below, angled upward to catch her in a climb. She rolled into it, letting it pass just beneath her hull, then dropped sharply, forcing the interceptor into a descent that strained every remaining system. The aircraft shuddered violently, the vibration breaking into uneven pulses that traveled through the frame like something tearing loose. Structural integrity at 42%. She didn't react. Another fighter cut across her path from the left, its movement clean, precise, its firing solution already established. She saw it, understood it, and moved anyway, pushing the interceptor into a turn that came a fraction too late. The impact hit along her flank, not a direct strike, but close enough to matter. The cockpit jolted, hard enough to snap her head slightly to the side, a sharp flash of light filling her vision before resolving again. Warning indicators flared across the console, overlapping, cascading. Multiple system failures. She exhaled slowly, steadying her hands as the controls lagged, then responded. The interceptor answered, slower now, heavier, but still answering, still flying. Below her, the final transport cleared the upper cloud layer. For a moment, it was alone against open sky. Then it climbed higher. Transport clear, trajectory stable, the voice said, and there was something in it now, something that hadn't been there before. Not relief. Not yet. Just the absence of immediate danger. Yuna watched it for exactly 1 second. Then she looked back at the fighters. They had not stopped. They had not broken. Their formation shifted again, but this time not toward the transport. Toward her. The objective had changed. The variable remained. And now there was nothing left to protect but the space she occupied.
Take a breath, because Yuna has done the impossible. Every transport cleared the atmosphere. The mission on paper is over, but her structural integrity is at 42%. Her systems are failing, and the alien formation has turned. There are no transport left to defend. There is only her. Commander Hale is no longer giving orders. He is begging her to come home. For the first time, there is no reason left to stay, only the decision itself.
Yuna, Hale said quieter now. All transports are clear. She didn't answer right away. The words settled into her slowly, filtering through the noise, through the strain, through the constant pressure of maintaining control. All clear. No more ascent vectors to defend. No more fragile trajectories to shield. Nothing left to hold. Her hands remained on the controls. The interceptor continued forward, carrying her into the tightening formation of alien fighters that no longer needed to divide their attention. For the first time since the engagement began, there was no external reason to stay, only the decision itself. The vibration in the aircraft steadied slightly, not because the strain had lessened, but because her inputs had become smaller, more controlled, less reactive. The heat remained critical, the warnings constant, but they faded into the background again, reduced to information rather than urgency. She inhaled once, slow and deep, then let it out. "Copy," she said. The word came quietly, not as an end, just as acknowledgement. She did not turn immediately. Not yet. The fighters were still closing. And she was still here. The fighters did not hesitate when the transports cleared. Their movement changed in a way that was immediate and absolute, like a switch had been flipped in whatever logic governed them. The wider formation collapsed inward, vectors tightening, every path converging on her position with a clarity that left no ambiguity. Before, she had been an obstacle between them and something else. Now she was the only objective left. Yuna watched the shift happen in real time, not through the clutter of her tactical display, which had begun to lag under the volume of data, but through the movement itself. The sky that had been layered with competing priorities resolved into a single pattern, clean and focused. It was almost simpler this way. Her hands adjusted on the controls, smaller movements now, conserving what little responsiveness the interceptor still had. The aircraft answered sluggishly, each correction delayed by fractions of a second that she could feel stretching longer with every input. The vibration had settled into something deeper, heavier, less sharp but more dangerous, like a system that had passed the point of warning and entered failure. "Yuna, disengage," Hale said. There was no command left in his voice now, only urgency stripped down to its core. "You've done your part. Bring it home." Home. The word landed somewhere distant, disconnected from the space she occupied. There was a runway somewhere beneath the smoke and the city, lights probably still active, systems waiting for an approach that might never come. There were people down there, technicians, med crews, others who had landed when they were told to. She pictured it for a second. Then she let it go. The first coordinated attack came as a tightening ring. Not a direct charge, not a reckless convergence, but a controlled reduction of space. Fighters moved into positions that overlapped fields of fire, creating a layered grid she would have to move through to survive. Every exit vector she identified was already accounted for, already covered. She exhaled slowly. Then she moved anyway. The interceptor surged forward with a strained response, the engine giving her one more burst of acceleration that she could feel tearing at the edges of its limits. She angled into the narrowest gap she could see, not because it was safe, but because it was the only place where their alignment wasn't perfect. The first shots came from above, cutting downward in clean lines that forced her into a roll before she had fully committed to her path. The aircraft resisted, the delay almost enough to cost her, but she pushed through it, correcting mid-motion, forcing the turn into something sharper, harsher. The second wave came from below, time to meet her exit. She saw it, adjusted again. A quick throttle cut followed by a sharp climb that dragged the interceptor through a space that hadn't existed a second earlier. The vibration spiked, then faltered. For a moment, less than a moment, the engine tone dropped. Her stomach tightened, a reflex she couldn't stop. Then it caught again. Not cleanly, not fully, but enough. Propulsion instability critical, the system reported. I know, she said under her breath. The fighters closed tighter. They were learning faster now, not just reacting to her movements, but anticipating the patterns within them. The small irregularities she had been using to break their timing were becoming less effective, their responses adjusting, tightening, removing the gaps she had relied on. She could feel it in the way the space around her shrank with each exchange. This was where it ended. Not all at once, not in a single decisive moment, but here, in the slow collapse of options, the steady reduction of what was possible until only one path remained. She didn't look for a new tactic. She didn't have one. Instead, she focused on what she still had. Control. Limited, delayed, but still present. Position. Narrow, contested, but still hers. Time. Not much, but still something. She angled the interceptor slightly downward, drawing the fighters with her, compressing their formation further as they followed. The air thickened as she dipped closer to the upper edge of the cloud layer, interference increasing, systems struggling to maintain clarity. The alien fighters adjusted, but the precision of their movements softened slightly, corrections becoming more frequent as the environment introduced noise into their calculations. It wasn't enough to give her an advantage, but it gave her friction, and friction slowed things down. She rolled again, tighter this time, forcing the interceptor into a maneuver that sent a sharp pain through her arms as she fought the controls. The aircraft shuddered violently, a deep, tearing vibration that ran through the frame like something coming loose. A warning indicator went dark. Not cleared. Failed. She didn't check which one. It didn't matter. A fighter broke through her forward view, closer than the others, its path cutting across her trajectory at an angle that left almost no room to adjust. Its weapon fired. She moved on instinct. A hard lateral push, a partial roll, not enough to fully evade, but enough to shift the point of impact. The shot grazed her hull, closer than anything had been before, and the cockpit filled with a brief, blinding flare. The impact slammed through the interceptor, a heavy, physical force that rattled her teeth and sent a shock through her body. The controls bucked in her hands, resistance spiking before dropping unevenly. Control response degraded, the system said. She swallowed, forcing her grip to steady. Still here, she muttered. The fighter that had fired passed by, its path carrying it forward before it adjusted to re-engage. For a fraction of a second, it was exposed. She fired. The shot connected cleanly, tearing through its structure and breaking it apart in a way that was almost quiet, almost controlled. It didn't explode. It simply stopped being one piece. She didn't watch it. There wasn't time. The rest were already closing again, filling the space it had left, the formation adapting instantly. No hesitation, no loss of cohesion. Her vision flickered again at the edges, the strain building, her body pushing against limits it had been approaching for too long. She blinked hard, forcing clarity back, focusing on the next movement, the next fraction of a second. Yuna, you need to come back now, Hale said. The words came fast, urgent, stripped of everything except the need for her to hear them. There's nothing left to hold. Nothing left to hold. The phrase echoed in her mind, settling differently than it had before. She glanced down, just for a second. The sky below was empty. No more transports. No more rising trails of engine burn. Just the broken cloud layer and the faint glow of the city beneath it. It was done. She had done it. The realization didn't bring relief. It didn't change anything about the space she was in, the fighters still closing, the aircraft still failing, the heat still climbing. But it changed the shape of the decision. She exhaled slowly, the breath leaving her in a steady release. Her hands adjusted on the controls, not to push forward, to turn. The interceptor responded with a delayed, uneven motion as she pulled it out of the engagement vector and angled it downward, toward the distant line of the city. The fighters reacted instantly, their paths shifting to pursue, their formation stretching slightly as they transitioned from containment to chase. She didn't accelerate immediately. She couldn't. The engine wouldn't take it. Instead, she let the descent build gradually, trading altitude for speed in a controlled fall that kept the interceptor just within the limits of what it could still manage. The vibration changed again, less violent now, more hollow, like something that had burned through its peak and was now running on whatever remained. Behind her, the fighters closed. They would catch her. She knew that. The calculations didn't need to be displayed for her to understand the outcome. But the distance to the ground was shorter now, and the time she had needed. She had already given it. She kept the nose down, the city rising to meet her, the runway somewhere within it still waiting, still possible. For the first time since she had pushed the throttle forward and flown into them, she allowed herself to think about landing. Not as certainty, just as a direction. She held that direction, and she did not look back. The descent did not feel like escape. It felt like a different kind of countdown. The city rose slowly at first, a dim geometry beneath the cloud layer, its edges softened by smoke and distance. As she dropped lower, details began to separate from the haze. Blocks of light, where power still held, long dark stretches where it did not. Thin lines of motion that marked ground vehicles still moving through streets that had not yet gone quiet. The runway would be there somewhere inside that pattern, one of the few places still cleared, still waiting. Behind her, the alien fighters followed. They did not rush the pursuit. They did not scatter or break formation. Their movement remained controlled, measured, their vectors adjusting to account for her descent while maintaining optimal distance. They did not need to close immediately. The outcome, from their perspective, was already decided. Yuna felt the change in her interceptor before she saw it reflected in the systems. The controls had grown heavier, each input requiring more force, more correction. The delay between movement and response stretched longer, forcing her to anticipate rather than react. The vibration had settled into a dull, constant tremor that ran through the frame like a second heartbeat, uneven and fading. "Yuna, you're coming in too fast," Hale said, his voice cutting through the channel with renewed urgency. "Reduce speed. You won't make the approach like this." She didn't answer, not because she disagreed, but because there wasn't anything to say. The engine was no longer responding in clean increments. Throttle adjustments came back uneven, sometimes delayed, sometimes not at all. She eased it back anyway, watching the indicators shift in irregular patterns that no longer followed expected behavior. The cloud layer swallowed her. For a moment, everything disappeared. The world outside the canopy dissolved into a dense, shifting gray, moisture streaking across the glass as she cut through it at speed. Visibility dropped to almost nothing. The only reference points left were the instruments in front of her and the memory of the path she had chosen. The fighters followed her into it. She saw them as flickers on the edge of her display, their signals distorted by the interference, their positions less certain now. The precision of their tracking degraded slightly, their formation loosening as the environment forced adjustments they could not fully compensate for. It wasn't much, but it was something. She leveled out slightly, easing the descent just enough to keep control, letting the thicker air slow her in ways the failing engine could not. The interceptor shuddered in response, the strain shifting from pure heat to structural stress as it pushed through denser atmosphere at speed. A warning light blinked, then went dark. Not cleared. Gone. She didn't check which system had failed. It didn't matter anymore. The cloud layer thinned. The city came back into view. Closer now. Real. The shapes of buildings sharper, the lines of streets more defined. Fires burned in scattered pockets, their light flickering against the darker grid of structures. The runway appeared ahead, a long, narrow strip of illuminated guidance cutting through the city's uneven glow. It was still intact. She aligned with it instinctively, adjusting her angle in small increments, fighting the delayed response of the controls to keep the interceptor on a stable approach vector. Behind her, the fighters emerged from the cloud. Closer than before, they had gained distance in the blind. She saw it in the way their signals resolved more clearly now, in the way their vectors tightened as they reacquired full tracking. They adjusted immediately, their paths narrowing, their speed increasing slightly as the final phase of pursuit began. "Yuna, they're right behind you," Hale said. There was no attempt to soften it now. "You need to bring it down now." She didn't respond. Her focus stayed forward. The runway stretched out ahead of her, longer than it should have felt, the distance to it both shrinking and stretching at the same time. Her descent rate was still too high. Her speed still too fast. The interceptor wasn't configured for a clean landing anymore. Too much damage. Too much strain. She could try to slow more. Risk losing control entirely. Or she could bring it down as it was. She chose. Her hands moved with careful precision, easing the nose up slightly, trading a fraction of speed for stability. The interceptor resisted, the controls sluggish, the response uneven, but it held. The vibration shifted again, less aggressive now, more like something running on the last of what it had. A shot passed above her, close enough that the light washed across the canopy in a sharp, white flash. They were in range. She didn't look back. She couldn't. Every fraction of her attention was locked on the approach, on the narrow strip of ground ahead, on the delicate balance between speed and control that would determine whether she touched down or tore apart on impact. Another shot. Closer. The interceptor jolted as something clipped the outer edge of its frame, a sharp impact that sent a ripple through the structure. The controls faltered for a fraction of a second, then returned, weaker but still responding. "Stay with it," Hale said, his voice lower now, steady despite everything. "Just stay with it." She exhaled slowly, steadying her hands. The ground rushed up to meet her. The runway filled her view. She adjusted again, a final correction, aligning the interceptor with the center line as best she could manage. The landing gear didn't deploy. She didn't expect it to. She kept the nose up. Held it. Held it. Then the interceptor hit. The impact was violent, a bone-deep jolt that slammed through her body as the aircraft struck the runway and scraped forward, metal grinding against reinforced surface with a sound that cut through everything else. Sparks exploded outward along both sides, bright and chaotic, trailing behind her as the interceptor skidded. The controls went loose in her hands. Not free, disconnected. She rode it out, holding what little alignment she could as the aircraft tore across the runway, slowing in uneven bursts as friction fought against its remaining momentum. Another impact, smaller but sharp enough to jar her forward against the restraints. Then, stillness. Not complete, but enough. The vibration faded. The engine tone dropped into a low, broken hum, then cut out entirely. Silence settled in, heavy and sudden, broken only by the faint creak of cooling metal and the distant, echoing sounds of a city still trying to function. Yuna didn't move immediately. Her hands remained on the controls, her grip still firm despite the absence of resistance. Her breathing came slow and controlled, each inhale steady, each exhale measured. She stared forward at the length of the runway ahead, at the faint glow of its lights stretching into the distance. Behind her, somewhere beyond the edge of her vision, the alien fighters passed overhead. They did not fire again. They did not descend. They continued forward, their paths carrying them beyond the city, beyond the engagement zone, their formation re-establishing itself as they withdrew. Yuna watched the empty sky ahead of her. Then, slowly, she let go of the controls and stayed where she was. For a while, nothing moved. The cockpit held its heat, thick and close, the air carrying the lingering smell of burned insulation and metal worn past its limits. The silence after the engine died was not complete. It never was, but it felt deeper than anything that had come before it. Small sounds began to surface, the faint ticking of cooling systems, the distant echo of something shifting outside the aircraft, the soft crackle of damaged circuitry settling into stillness. Yuna stayed where she was. Her hands had loosened from the controls, but they hadn't dropped. They rested there, fingers curved as if the aircraft might still answer them if she asked. Her breathing slowed gradually, the rhythm of it no longer tied to maneuvers or timing or the constant calculation of what came next. There was no next. The realization didn't arrive all at once. It unfolded quietly, settling into place without resistance. No more vectors to track. No more adjustments to make. No more seconds to stretch into something useful. Just the space she occupied. The canopy in front of her was streaked with residue from the descent, fine lines of moisture and particulate caught in the light of the runway. Beyond it, the city remained in motion, but slower now. The urgency that had driven everything upward had shifted outward, into the distance, into whatever came after. A voice came through her headset, softer than before, almost careful. "Yuna, respond." She didn't answer immediately, not because she couldn't, but because the act of speaking felt like it belonged to a different moment, one that hadn't quite connected to this one yet. She swallowed once, the dryness in her throat more noticeable now that everything else had quieted. "I'm here," she said. Her voice sounded different to her own ears. Thinner, less anchored, as if it had been pulled through everything that had just happened and hadn't fully settled back into place. There was a pause on the other end, a brief gap where nothing was said, and in that gap, she could almost feel the shift, the release of tension that had been held too tightly for too long. "Copy," Hales said. The word came out slower than it had before, carrying something that wasn't part of protocol. "Stay where you are. We're sending a crew." She nodded slightly, then realized he couldn't see it. "Okay." The channel remained open, but neither of them spoke again. There wasn't anything that needed to be filled with words. Yuna let her gaze drift upward, past the runway, past the low structures at its edge, to the sky beyond. It was different now. Not empty, never empty, but cleared in a way it hadn't been before. The movement that had filled it, structured it, pressed against it from every direction, was gone. In its place, there were only a few distant lights. Small, steady, climbing. The last of the transports had already broken atmosphere, their trajectories carrying them beyond what she could see. What remained were the faint traces of their ascent, the final evidence of something that had been in motion and had not stopped. She watched them until they were too far to distinguish. Then she lowered her gaze again. The cockpit felt smaller now that the urgency had drained out of it. The space she had been contained within for hours pressed indifferently, no longer defined by function but by absence. She became aware of details she hadn't registered before, the slight tremors still lingering in her hands, the stiffness in her shoulders, the weight of the harness across her chest. She lifted one hand slowly from the controls. It hesitated in the air for a moment, as if unsure where to go without something to hold. Then she let it rest against the side of the cockpit. The metal was warm, not dangerously so anymore, but still carrying the residual heat of everything it had endured. She kept her hand there, feeling it, grounding herself in something physical, something immediate. Outside, movement began to return, not in the sky, but on the ground. Small vehicles approached along the edge of the runway, their lights cutting narrow paths through the dimness. Figures moved with them, shapes resolving into people as they drew closer, their pace controlled but urgent in a different way now. Not reacting, responding. Yuna watched them without moving. Her breathing had settled fully now, each inhale and exhale even, steady, detached from the rhythm of combat that had defined it for so long. Her body still held the memory of that rhythm, the tension waiting to return, but there was nothing to trigger it anymore. The door mechanism didn't respond when she tried it. She pressed the release once, then again, the control unresponsive beneath her fingers. For a moment, she considered forcing it, applying more pressure, trying to override whatever had failed. Then she stopped. It didn't matter. They were already there. A shadow crossed the canopy, followed by the muted sound of something striking the exterior. Another impact, more controlled, and then the outline above her shifted as the emergency release was engaged from outside. The canopy lifted slowly, unevenly, a gap opening that let cooler air spill into the cockpit. It carried with it the smell of the outside world, smoke, fuel, something sharper underneath that she didn't try to identify. Hands reached in, not hurried, not rough, just certain. "Easy," someone said, their voice close, real, belonging to the same space she occupied now. "We've got you." Yuna looked at them, her eyes taking a moment to adjust to faces instead of displays, to expressions instead of indicators. They looked back at her with something she didn't immediately understand. Not surprise, not disbelief, recognition. She let them unfasten the harness, let them guide her hands away from the controls. When she moved, it felt different, heavier, as if gravity had increased while she wasn't paying attention. Her legs didn't respond cleanly at first, the connection between intention and movement slightly delayed. They supported her without making it obvious. One on each side, steady, matching her pace as they helped her out of the cockpit and down onto the runway. Her boots touched the ground. Solid, unmoving, real in a way that the air had not been. She stood there for a moment, not walking yet, just standing, feeling the difference. The absence of motion, the absence of vibration, the absence of everything she had just been inside. Around her, The crew moved with quiet efficiency, some already turning their attention to the interceptor, others staying close, watching her without crowding. She didn't look back at the aircraft immediately. When she did, it was slowly. The interceptor sat low on the runway, its structure visibly damaged, sections warped or missing entirely, its surface marked by the path it had taken to get here. It didn't look like something that should have still been in one piece. But it was. She held that image for a moment, then let it settle. Commander Hale approached from the far side of the runway, his pace measured, not rushed. He stopped a short distance in front of her, close enough that she could see the details in his expression, the lines that hadn't been there before, or that she hadn't noticed. For a second, neither of them spoke. There was too much in the space between words. He looked at her, not as a pilot returning from a sortie, not as a report waiting to be given, but as someone who had been somewhere he could not follow. "You landed," he said. It wasn't a question. Yuna nodded once. A small movement. Enough. He let out a breath he had probably been holding longer than he realized, then glanced past her at the interceptor, then back again. "All transports are clear," he said. She knew. Still, hearing it again anchored it differently. She looked past him, back toward the sky, now empty except for distance and what had already gone. Her voice, when it came, was quiet. "Good." That was all she said, and it was enough. They moved her away from the runway without urgency, but without pause either. The ground crew did not rush her, and they did not slow for her. They matched her pace exactly, adjusting without comment each time her step faltered just slightly before correcting. The world felt heavier now, every motion carrying weight that hadn't existed in the cockpit. Her legs responded, but not cleanly. The delay between intention and action lingered, like the echo of a system that had been pushed too far and had not yet reset. She kept walking. The sounds around her came back in layers. The low hum of ground vehicles idling, the distant clatter of equipment being moved into place. Voices, controlled and steady, not raised, not urgent, but purposeful. Somewhere farther off, something metallic collapsed with a hollow crash, followed by a brief burst of shouted instructions that cut off just as quickly. Life returning to structure. She became aware of her hands again. One of them still trembled slightly, the movement small but persistent, a fine vibration that hadn't left her even after the aircraft had gone still. She curled her fingers once, then again, watching the motion as if it belonged to someone else. "Med units this way," one of the crew said beside her, not guiding, just informing. She nodded, though she didn't turn toward it yet. Her gaze drifted back over her shoulder. The interceptor remained where it had come to rest, surrounded now by personnel and equipment, its damaged frame lit by portable lamps that cast long, uneven shadows across the runway. From this distance, it looked smaller than it had in the air, less like something that had held space against an entire formation, more like a machine that had simply reached the end of what it could do. She watched it for a moment longer, then turned forward again. They reached the edge of the runway, where the surface shifted from reinforced landing strip to the harder, rougher texture of service ground. The transition felt different under her boots, less smooth, more real. She adjusted to it automatically, her stride settling into something steadier as the ground gave her more feedback. The medical team was waiting, positioned just beyond the immediate activity, their setup efficient, contained. They didn't move toward her until she was within reach. When they did, it was controlled, practiced. "Lieutenant CO," one of them said, stepping into her line of sight. "We're going to run a quick assessment." She looked at them, taking in the details without really focusing on any one thing. The uniform, the equipment, the way they held themselves, ready but not urgent. "I'm fine," she said. It wasn't defiance. It wasn't dismissal. It was just the closest thing to an answer she had. The medic held her gaze for a second, then gave a small nod. "We'll still check." She didn't argue. They guided her to sit, the motion simple but requiring more effort than it should have. When she lowered herself onto the edge of the portable platform, her legs felt heavier than they had a moment before, as if the act of stopping had allowed the weight to settle fully. The medic worked quickly, efficient hands checking for injuries she hadn't registered, scanning indicators, asking questions in a calm, even tone. "Any loss of consciousness?" "No." "Vision issues?" She blinked once, slow. "No." "Pain?" She paused. There was pain. In her shoulders. Her arms. A dull, spreading ache that ran through her body like something that had been building for hours and was only now being allowed to surface. Nothing specific, she said. The medic studied her for a moment, then nodded again, making a note without comment. Around them, the activity continued, steady and controlled. No one was running. No one was shouting. The urgency that had defined everything before had dissipated, replaced by something quieter, more deliberate. A different kind of work. Yuna's gaze drifted again, not searching for anything, just moving. It settled on the sky once more, now darker, the last traces of light fading into distance. There was nothing moving up there anymore. No formations. No structured lines of motion. Just open space. Commander Hale approached again, stopping just outside the immediate reach of the medical team. He didn't interrupt. He waited, hands at his sides, his posture steady in a way that suggested he was holding something in place. When the medic stepped back, giving a small nod to indicate they were finished for now, Hale stepped forward. "You held them longer than we thought possible," he said. It wasn't said as praise. It was said as fact. Yuna looked at him, then away, her gaze dropping briefly to her hands. The tremor had lessened, but it hadn't stopped entirely. She pressed her fingers together once, feeling the pressure, grounding herself in the sensation. "They needed time," she said. Hale nodded once. "They got it." The words settled between them, simple and complete. For a moment, neither of them spoke again. The silence wasn't empty. It carried everything that had happened, everything that hadn't been said during it, everything that didn't need to be explained now. In the distance, one of the ground vehicles powered down, its engine cutting off with a low, final hum. The sound echoed briefly, then faded, leaving the space quieter than before. Yuna exhaled slowly. The air felt different now. Cooler. Thinner in a way that had nothing to do with altitude and everything to do with the absence of pressure. She leaned back slightly, just enough to shift the weight off her legs, her shoulders relaxing by a fraction. The tension didn't leave all at once. It unraveled slowly, piece by piece, as if her body didn't quite trust that it was allowed to stop holding it. Hale followed her gaze briefly, looking out toward the runway, the interceptor, the crews still working around it. When he looked back, there was something in his expression that hadn't been there before. Not relief exactly. Not pride. Understanding. "You can stand down," he said. The phrase was routine. Standard. Something said at the end of operations, at the close of a mission. But here, it meant something else. Yuna heard it. Let it settle. Then she shook her head, just slightly. Not yet. Hale didn't question it. He didn't need to. He nodded once, accepting the answer without asking for explanation, and stepped back, giving her the space she hadn't asked for but still needed. Yuna sat there for a moment longer, her gaze unfocused, her thoughts not forming into anything clear. The world around her continued to move, steady and controlled, rebuilding itself from what had just happened. She placed her hands on her knees and pushed herself up slowly. Her legs held this time. Not perfectly, but enough. She took one step forward, then another. She became aware of her breathing again. Steady, even, no longer tied to movement or reaction. Just there. She drew in a slow breath and let it out, watching the way the air moved in front of her, visible only for a moment in the cooler night. It faded quickly, leaving nothing behind. Commander Hale stood farther back now, speaking with someone near the edge of the command vehicles. His posture had changed. Less rigid, less contained. The lines of strain had not disappeared, but they had settled into something that would remain for a while. He glanced toward her once, then returned to his conversation, not interrupting, not calling her back. Whatever needed to be said between them had already been said. Yuna turned her gaze forward again. The runway stretched out in front of her, empty now, its surface marked by the path her interceptor had carved into it during landing. Scorched lines ran along its length, dark against the lighter material, a visible trace of momentum brought under control by force and friction. At the far end, the lights continued to burn, steady and unchanged. For a moment, she imagined the approach again. Not the fear, not the strain, just the alignment. The narrow focus on a single line in a world that had been filled with movement. The act of holding that line, even as everything else tried to pull her away from it. She let the image pass. It didn't need to stay. A technician crossed the runway at a distance. carrying a small piece of equipment that looked insignificant against the scale of everything else. He moved quickly but not urgently, his steps confident, practiced. When he reached the other side, he paused, adjusted his grip, then continued on. Ordinary movement, ordinary purpose. It felt heavier than it should have. Yuna lowered herself slowly to sit on the edge of the runway, the motion deliberate, controlled. The surface was cool beneath her now, the heat from earlier long gone. She rested her hands against it, feeling the texture, the slight imperfections where wear had accumulated over time. Solid, unmoving. She looked down at her hands again. The tremor had finally stopped. Her fingers were still. She flexed them once, then let them rest. For a long moment, she did nothing else. The world continued around her, steady and quiet, rebuilding itself in ways that did not require her immediate attention. For the first time since she had pushed the throttle forward and flown into the formation, there was no demand placed on her at all. No decision waiting. No movement required. Just the space she occupied. She leaned back slightly, shifting her weight onto her arms, and let her gaze lift once more toward the sky. It seemed larger now, not because it had changed, but because nothing was pressing against it anymore. No lines. No formations. No narrowing paths. Just distance. Just the faint, almost imperceptible traces of where something had passed through and continued on. Somewhere up there, beyond what she could see, the transports were still moving, carrying everything they had taken with them. People who would not know her name, who would never see this runway, who would never feel the heat of the cockpit or the vibration of a machine pushed beyond its limits. They didn't need to. That wasn't what this had been for. She drew in another slow breath, held it, then let it go. A small sound reached her from somewhere behind. Someone laughing, briefly, softly, the kind of laugh that came not from humor, but from the release of something that had been held too tightly. It faded quickly, but it stayed with her longer than the sound itself. She closed her eyes for a second, not to rest, just to feel the absence of everything that had been there before. When she opened them again, nothing had changed. And that was the point. The runway remained. The city remained. The sky remained. And in that stillness, in that space where nothing was asking anything more of her, the meaning of what had happened settled into something simple, something that did not need to be spoken to exist. She had been told to land. She had been told to leave. She had been given every reason to turn away. And she had not. She stayed. Not toward the med unit. Not toward the command post. Back toward the runway. Back toward the interceptor. No one stopped her. No one tried. They watched, some of them, their attention following her without turning it into something obvious. Others continued their work, trusting the structure around them to hold. Yuna walked steadily now, each step more certain than the last, the ground solid beneath her, the air cool against her skin. She stopped a few meters from the interceptor. Up close, the damage was clearer. Panels warped and torn, scoring along the hull where near impacts had grazed instead of penetrated. Sections where the surface had simply burned away, leaving darker, rougher material exposed beneath. She reached out, placing her hand against the side of the aircraft. The metal was still warm. She left her hand there, not gripping, not holding, just resting. For a long moment, she said nothing. Then, quietly, almost to herself, "I didn't freeze this time." The words didn't carry far. They didn't need to. She closed her eyes for a second, then opened them again, and stayed there. The runway grew quieter as the work around it settled into routine. The urgency that had carried everyone through the last hours had thinned into something steadier, something sustainable. Lights remained on, casting long reflections across the worn surface, but fewer voices cut through the air now. Movements were smaller, measured, the kind that came after something had already been decided. Yuna stood beside the interceptor, her hand still resting against its side. The warmth beneath her palm had begun to fade, the heat of the metal bleeding away into the night air. Up close, the aircraft looked less like a machine and more like a record of everything it had passed through. Each mark, each warped section, each place where the surface had been stripped or bent told a part of the same story. None of it had been designed. None of it had been planned. It had simply held. She let her hand fall away. Around her, the crews continued their work without drawing attention to her presence. They moved around the aircraft, under it, across it, cataloging damage, stabilizing what remained, preparing it to be moved. No one asked her anything. No one needed to. What had happened was already understood in the only way that mattered. She stepped back once, then again, creating a small distance between herself and the interceptor. It didn't feel like leaving. It felt like placing something down after carrying it for too long. The sky above the city had cleared further. What remained of the cloud layer had thinned into uneven streaks, drifting slowly, no longer shaped by the violence that had pushed through it earlier. Beyond that, higher and farther than anything else, faint points of light marked the path of the transports that had made it out. They were difficult to see now. Small, almost still. She focused on one, following it as long as she could before it blurred into the rest of the sky. There was no way to know which one it was. No way to know who was inside. It didn't matter. They were gone. That was the only part that stayed. Behind her, a group of crew members paused briefly near the edge of the runway. One of them said something too low to carry, and the others answered with quiet, tired agreement. Then they moved again, returning to their tasks, their voices fading back into the background. Yuna remained where she was. The noise of the world had settled into a kind of balance. Not silent, but not pressing. The absence of immediate threat had created space, and in that space, smaller things became clearer. The sound of footsteps on concrete, the faint rustle of fabric as someone shifted their weight, the distant hum of systems still running somewhere deeper in the base.
Take a breath, because Yuna has done the impossible. Every transport cleared the atmosphere. The mission on paper is over, but her structural integrity is at 42%. Her systems are failing, and the alien formation has turned. There are no transport left to defend. There is only her. Commander Hale is no longer giving orders. He is begging her to come home. For the first time, there is no reason left to stay, only the decision itself.